Trumas Perak Aleph Mishnah Aleph. Chamisha lo yisremu. 5 people may not separate truma. V'imtarmu ein trumas and truma. And if they did try to separate truma, their truma is not valid. That is, the portion they designated did not become truma, so truma must be separated again from that produce. Cherish is a deaf mute, someone who cannot hear and cannot speak. V'hashaita, an insane person. A person is considered insane if he regularly destroys things that are given to him. The Gemara Chagiga brings a list of 3 things that are the requirements of a person to be qualified as a shaita. V'hakatan, a minor, a child is a minor until he is 13, or for a girl if she is 12. Again, a katan is a child under bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah. Someone who separates truma from produce that is not his without the owner's permission. Truma must be separated by the owner of the produce. If anyone else separated truma for him, the truma is not good. However, if the owner asks someone to separate truma for him or gives him permission to do so, the other person becomes the owner's agent, called a shliach, and can indeed separate truma on his behalf. This works because of the halacha of shluchai shalom k'maisai. The agent of a person is like him. That is, the actions of an agent are considered as if they were done by the one who appointed him. A guy who separated truma from the produce of a Jew, even if he acted with the owner's permission, his truma is not truma. So why is this? The Rav explains, even if he got permission from the Yid, if the Yid made him a shliach to take of truma, the pasuk says, Kain tarimu gam atem. Gam is l'rabba shluchachem, and the Gemara continues that ma atem b'nei bris av shluchachem b'nei bris. Just like you are b'nei bris, so too, meaning are yidden, so too the shliach also has to be a yid. Only a Jew can become the legal agent of another Jew. A guy cannot. The Mishnah's laws are learned from a pasuk. Daber al b'nei Yisrael v'yichu li truma me'ez kolish she'edvenu libar tikchu es trumasi v'zeis truma she'tikchu me'itam. Speak to Bnei Yisrael, and let them take from me truma. From every man whose mind motivates him, you shall take my truma. This is the truma that you shall take from them. The words children of Bnei Yisrael exclude a goy. The words from every man exclude a katan. The words whose mind motivates him, as sheid venu libai, excludes a deaf mute and a shaita, who are legally defined as lacking mindfulness. And the words from them exclude someone who separates truma from produce that is not his own. Even though these psukim speak about the donation towards the Mishkan at the beginning of Parshas Truma, but since it calls the donations Truma, the halachas it teaches are also applied to the Truma produce, as I stated in the Pirush Mishnayos Rambam. In Chazal, that there are, I believe it's the beginning of Brais and Melech's Mishkan, goes through the different types of Truma, the Truma of this, of the Mishkan, the Chiv of Truma of this, and Truma's Halishka, just about anything that has a title of truma on it. Mishnah base. Cherish hamedaber ve'en shemei lo yisrem. In Mishnah Aleph we learned that a cherish is somebody who's deaf mute, who can't speak or hear, may not separate truma, and if he did, the truma is no good. This Mishnah deals with the case of a person who is able to speak. So cherish hamedaber ve'en shemei lo yisrem. A deaf person who can speak but cannot hear may not separate truma. But if he did separate truma, his truma is valid truma. Since this person can speak, he has the legal ability to separate truma, but since he cannot hear, he should not separate truma in the first place, because he must hear the brachas he recites before doing a mitzvah. Before doing a mitzvah, we recite a bracha in which we thank Hashem for having to do whichever the mitzvah is. The halacha requires that one should hear the bracha of one should hear the words of the bracha that he makes, which a deaf person cannot do. The portion he separates is nevertheless valid truma, because even if someone did not recite the bracha, the mitzvah is effective. It's interesting because Lamaisa does separate truma. If he did separate truma, the truma is a valid truma. Since this person can't speak, he has a legal ability to separate truma. Also, we're talking about the bracha here. So even though the bracha is not ma'akiv in the mitzvah, the portion he separated is nevertheless valid truma, because even if someone did not recite the bracha before doing a mitzvah, the mitzvah is effective. It's very interesting, because Lamaisa, there's a stipler in brachas, I believe it is, that explains there's a difference between birkas hamitzvos and birkas hanen. The birkas hamitzvos, in essence, is a shvach v'aydah HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he was mekadosh us with his mitzvahs. And we say that before we do the mitzvah as a term of for giving us the mitzvahs. So now you'll say, what's the difference between that and Birkas Hanen, something that I'm benefiting from? For example, making a bar pragofen on a cup of wine, or hamaitzi on a chalarol, whatever it may be, right? But the concept is that when it comes to Birkas Hanen, the Gemara says that so there's a separate isser of not eating before you make a bracha, even though there's a chiyuv to make a Birkas HaMitzvahs, but there's no isser to do the mitzvah without the bracha. It's much more severe. There's an atilas reshus by Birkas Hanen. So by Birkas Hanen, the only way to make sure that it's not going to be gzela is by making a bracha. Mashenke by mitzvahs, it's not gzela to do the mitzvah without making the bracha. Okay. The Mishnah says the general rule about the word cherish, which was used here in connection with a deaf person who can speak, what was used in the previous Mishnah to mean a deaf person who cannot speak. Wherever the Chachamim mention a cherish, that means someone who cannot hear and cannot speak, is in the previous Mishnah. Only where they add that he can speak do they refer to a deaf person who has the power of speech. This is not an absolute rule, because there are places where the Mishnah does use the word cherish without any added description, and yet it refers to a deaf person who can speak. For example, the beginning of Chagiga. Just want to mention that there's a Rashi in Psachim, on Daf Mem Gimel, I believe it is, that says the Gemara is talking about different types of doughs, about when they become chametz. And there's something called a batek hacherish, the dough of the deaf. It does not mean that a deaf person made the dough, but it's a very thick kind of dough. And it's hard to tell if the inside is fully baked or not. So, because we don't know what's going on inside, it's referred to as cherish. That's how Rashi explains it, which is very interesting. So that would come out that the concept of a cherish isn't so much that because he can't hear, so he's not, he's going to be excluded from mitzvahs. The reason why he's excluded from mitzvahs is because we can't communicate with him to actually know if what's going on in his mind. I mean, is he of sound mind or not? And it's interesting because the Ma'aser Gemara Gittin on Daf Ayin says that if Daf Ayin Ayin Aleph, that if he could communicate with his hands, which was the derech of the Parsian to communicate during the meals, like the Gemara says in Brachas. So if they had this concept of communication with sign language, so then you could communicate with him, and then you'd be able to tell right away that he's of sound mind. But if you can't communicate with him, that's who we're talking about over here. That does not have was going to be excluded from it. So obviously this is not halacha l'maisa, but yeah. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. Katan shlehevish desaris. If a minor has not grown 2 pubic hairs, if he separates truma, Rabbi Yehuda Omer truma, so truma, Rabbi Yehuda says his truma is valid. A minor is not allowed to separate truma. Katan is not allowed to separate truma in the first place, but if he did, bidi eved, the separated portion is good truma. However, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, a minor has the ability to separate truma only after he reaches the age of chinuch. He's old enough to be taught how to do mitzvah. So Rabbi Yehuda agrees that truma separated by a younger child is not valid. The words used by Rabbi Yehuda, a katan who has not grown 2 hairs, shtei cyrus, apparently refers to a minor who is old enough in years to be an adult, which would be 13 years old for a boy and 12 years old for a girl, but is just lacking the shtei cyrus. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that a much younger child can also separate truma. He says a katan shalei hevi shtei cyrus, in order to teach that even a katan who's older, who's let's say 12 and a half, is forbidden to separate truma in the first place if he did not bring shtei cyrus. Rabbi Yossi says, I'm imach lebalo enas nadarim. If a minor separated truma before he reached the age of an Nadarim, which would be 12 years old for a boy and 11 years old for a girl. Now, what is this? In truma, say truma, his truma is not valid. What is this? A neder is a statement in which a person says that an item is forbidden to himself or others. The item becomes forbidden because the neder gives it a level of kedusha. Separating truma is similar because one thereby gives a separated portion of the kedusha of truma. Rabbi Yossi rules, therefore, that just as the age of Nadarim suffices with respect to making a neder, so does it suffice with respect to separating truma because it makes it kaddish. Okay. The Oinas Nadarim begins when a boy reaches 12 and a girl reaches 11. It's called the age of Nadarim because a vow, a neder made by someone at this age is binding, provided that he or she understands the concept of the Nadarim. But if he separated it after he reaches the Oinas Nadarim, his truma is going to be good, as we just explained. Mishnah Dalet. Ein term and zeisam al hashemen. We may not separate olives as truma for olive oil. V'loy anovim al yayin, and we may not separate grapes as truma for wine. That is, if someone has raw olives and olive oil and needs to separate truma from both of them, He may not separate from the olives alone an amount of truma that's large enough. And we may not separate grapes as truma for wine. That is, if someone has raw olives and olive oil and needs to separate truma from both of them, he may not separate from the olives alone an amount of truma that's large enough for both the olives and the oil. Rather, he must separate truma from the olives separately and from the oil separately. The same is true of grapes and wine. The Torah describes truma as dogon min hagoyran, grain from the threshing floor. This refers to grain that has been fully processed, because the processing of grain is completed at the threshing floor, when the threshed grain is stacked up in a pile and the pile is smoothed out. The pasuk thus teaches that one may not separate truma from grain or any other produce before it has been processed. Similarly, one may not separate truma from unprocessed produce for processed produce, or from processed produce for unprocessed produce. Raw olives or grapes from which one intends to make oil or wine are unprocessed. Therefore, one may not separate truma from olives or grapes for oil or wine, because it's not the same thing. If someone did not follow this halacha and did separate truma from olives for both olive oil and or other olives, or grapes for both grapes and wine, the truma is certainly not valid for the oil. Now it's going to be machlekes tanoim whether it's good truma for the olives themselves. If they did separate truma from olives for olive oil and other olives, Beishamai say that their own truma is within them. That is, the separated olives contain truma only for their other olives, but not for the oil. The other olives are now chulin, since truma was successfully separated from them, but the oil remains tevel as before. Some of the separated olives are truma, while the rest of the separated olives are chulin, just like the other olives. A non-kohen is forbidden to eat any of the separated olives, because it's not known which of them are chulin and which are truma. He must therefore give all of them to a kohen, and he may charge the kohen the value of the olives before that are chulin. Beisil Amrim ain't truma. Some truma, Beisil said that the truma is not valid truma at all. Even the part of the truma that was separated from the olives did not become truma, since a single truma separation was made, and part of the truma separation was no good, so the entire separation is not valid. Both the olives and the olive oil remain tevel. It seems from this Mishnah, though, that if unprocessed produce is separated as truma for processed produce, the truma is invalid. However, we shall see later that in most situations the truma is in fact good, and that our Mishnah is dealing with an exception to the rule, as we'll see later on in this parak. Mishnah Hey, Ein termin min aleket min hashikha min hapeh. We may not separate truma from leket, shikha, or peh. The Torah requires that certain portions of the crop be left at a poor to take and include leket, which is 1 or 2 stalks that fell during the harvest. Shikha is sheaves or stalks that were forgotten in the field, and peh, a section of the field that must be left unharvested for the aniyim. Because these portions are considered the matnas aniyim, they belong to the aniyim. The owner of the field cannot use them as truma for his own produce. Umin hafkarim, from ownerless produce. If produce was ownerless at some point before the completion of its processing, it remains potter from trumas forever, even after someone was koine. Therefore, one cannot designate such produce as truma for other produce, because it's not possible to separate truma from something that's potter from truma altogether. The halacha that hefker is potter from meiser is learned out from a pasuk about Levi kein lechelik v'nachal imach. The Levi shall come to take meiser rishon, for he has no share or inheritance with you. By saying that he doesn't have a chelik v'nachal imach, the pasuk teaches that a Levi receives meiser rishon only from privately owned produce, somebody that's shayach to produce that was shayach to chelik v'nachla. Ownerless produce is therefore potter from meiser rishon, because a Levi has as much of a claim to ownerless produce as anyone else. Although the pasuk was said in reference to meiser rishon, the halacha applies to other meisers, including truma. The lemi meiser rishon shenitel trumasai, and not for meiser rishon whose truma's meiser was taken. After the owner separates truma, he separates 1/10 of what remains as meiser rishon, which he gives to a Levi. A Levi receives meiser rishon and separates 1/10 of that, and gives that 1/10 to a kohen. That's called trumas meiser. There's no need to remove truma gedola from meiser rishon, because truma gedola was already separated from the entire crop, including the part that would later be designated as meiser rishon. In view of the fact that meiser rishon is potter from truma gedola, it cannot be used as truma for other produce, because it's impossible to separate truma from produce which is potter from, which does not have a chiyuv of truma at all. The Mishnah refers specifically to meiser rishon whose trumas meiser has been taken. This implies that before the trumas meiser is taken, the Levi can indeed separate truma gedola from his meiser rishon on behalf of the other produce. Since trumas meiser must still be separated from his meiser rishon, is not considered to be potter even in regard to truma gedola. V'lemi meiser sheni v'hektish sheniftu, and not for meiser sheni or hektish, even if they were redeemed. In years 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, after the owner separates meiser rishon, he separates meiser sheni, which he brings to Yerushalayim and eats there. The Torah allows him, if he wishes, to redeem his Meiser Sheni with money, in which case the Kedusha of the Meiser Sheni is transferred to the money. He then takes the money to Yerushalayim and uses it to buy food, which he eats there. And Hektish, an item of Hektish is something which was donated to the Beis HaMikdash, can also be redeemed with money. The Kedusha of the item is transferred to the money and becomes Kadosh in its place. Meiser Sheni v'Hektish and Nifdu are potter from Meiser. As such, they cannot be designated as Truma for produce that is obligated in Meiser. Meiser Sheni is potter from Meiser because it is separated from the crop after the other Trumas and Meisers have been separated. The Hektish mentioned here is also potter from Meiser because the Mishnah refers to a case where someone donated unprocessed tevel to the Beis HaMikdash and it was not redeemed until after it was processed. Because its processing was completed while it was owned by the Beis HaMikdash, it's potter from Meiser. This is learned out of a pasuk. When the Mishnah says that they were nifta, it means that even if they were redeemed, they cannot be separated truma from them because they are potter from Meiser before being nifta. However, they cannot be used for truma at all, even if they're mechuyev in Meiser. This is because Meiser Sheni and Hektish Shaloi Nifdu do not belong to the owner of the field in which they grew. Rather, the unredeemed Meiser Sheni belongs to Shemayim, and unredeemed Hektish is the property of the Beis HaMikdash. So clearly, one cannot use produce that does not belong to him as truma for his own produce. And not from produce that's mechuyev in Meiser for that which is potter from Meiser, and not from produce which is exempt for that which is obligated. In addition to the cases listed above, another example of exempt produce is grain that has not reached a third of its full growth. Such grain is not mechuyev in Meiser, and therefore one cannot separate truma from it on behalf of the grain that has grown a third, or vice versa. And not from produce that's detached from the ground for that which is attached to the ground, and not from that which is attached to the ground for that which is detached from the ground. Both the portion designated as truma and the produce for which it is designated must be detached from the ground. It must be harvested grain or picked fruit. This is learned out from the pasuk V'harei moisem imenu trumas Hashem. The word V'harei moisem, you shall raise up, teaches that one must be able to lift the truma, which implies that it is detached from the ground. The word mimenu, from it, suggests that the produce for which the truma is designated must also be detached from the ground. And not from the new crop which grew this year for the old crop which grew last year, and not from the old crop for the new crop. Truma has to be separated from produce that grow the same year as the produce for which it is designated. This says in the pasuk, Aser to Aser is called Tvua Zarecha Yetze Hasad Shana Shana. You shall take off Meiser from the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field, year by year. V'lemi peres al peres chutz la'aretz, v'lemi peres chutz la'aretz al peres ha'aretz, and not from produce of Eretz Yisrael for the produce of chutz la'aretz, and not from the produce of chutz la'aretz for the produce of Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah teaches that even if the produce that grew outside Eretz Yisrael was brought into Eretz Yisrael and processed there, it's potter from Meiser because it says Chol Maser ha'aretz mizera ha'aretz, any master of the land, of the seed of the land. Only the seed of the land is mechuyev Meiser. Anything that grew in a different country is potter from Meiser, even if it was processed in Eretz Yisrael, and thus it cannot be designated as truma for produce that grew in Eretz Yisrael. V'im tarmu ein trumas and truma, and if people separated truma in any of these situations, their truma is not truma. Mishnah Vav. Chamisha lo Yisrael v'im tarmu trumas and truma. At the beginning of the parak, the Mishnah listed 5 types of people who lack the legal ability to separate truma, and if they do separate truma, it does not become truma. Now, this Mishnah will teach us a list of 5 people who are not allowed to take truma lechatchila, but if they did, it is b'di evet good. Chamisha lo Yisrael v'im tarmu trumas and truma. Ha'ilem, someone who cannot speak. The Mishnah must be referring to a person, though unable to speak, is capable of hearing. If he were also unable to hear, his truma would be invalid, as we learned in Mishnah Aleph. A person who cannot speak is capable of designating truma because it is enough to designate truma in one's mind. There's no need to actually say this portion is truma. A hashikar, someone who is drunk. In this context, a drunk person is defined as someone who is too drunk to address a king properly. V'ha'orei, someone who is not dressed. It's forbidden to recite a bracha or any davar shabaktusha when one is not clothed. This is learned out from the pasuk v'liyira b'charvas davar, and he shall not see a shameful thing among you. The pasuk is interpreted to teach that one's erva should not be seen when one speaks dibur of kedusha. Liyira b'cha ervas davar, that the erva shouldn't be by any davar shabaktusha. V'hasuma, someone who cannot see. Ubalkari, Ezra decreed that a Balkari may not recite holy words until he is tovel in a mikveh. The Gzeira was rescinded, was abolished, and the Mishnah refers to a time when it was still in force. There's a big nidin about, what was the pshat on this. There's a big Rambam about it, and there's a lot of Torah on this, which Mitzvah will discuss at a further date. So lo yisramu v'mtarim v'trumas and truma. They may not separate truma, but if they did, the truma is valid. A person who cannot speak, an undressed person, and a balkari may not separate truma because they're unable or forbidden to say the bracha that should be recited before doing the mitzvah. A shikr and someone who cannot see, a summa, may not separate truma because they're unable to choose the best produce. The Torah says that truma should be separated mikol chelbai from the best of the crop, and they don't know the difference. Nevertheless, the produce that any of these people designates is valid truma because truma separation is effective even if the bracha was not said before it, or even if the produce is of poor quality that's chosen, which is interesting because Lamaisa, we explained in the Akdama, and we'll see later on, that there are 3 levels, right? And I guess a person who normally does a 50th, or normally does a 40th, or normally does a 60th, so that's what he should do, right? He's not mechuyev to change if that's what he does. Either way, he could get away with that and still be yotze. But over here, the pshat is that he's not of sound mind enough, or he doesn't know, he can't recognize the difference between good quality and bad quality. Mishnah Zayin. Ein termin lebe midov, lebe mishkov, lebe minyan. The Torah doesn't specify a minimum amount for truma, unlike meiser and trumas meiser, which must consist of a tenth. According to the Torah, even a single kernel of grain is enough truma for a large pile. The Chachamim instituted guidelines for the amount of truma one needs to separate, as will be mentioned in Mishnah Dalet. The following Mishnah discusses how one should go about separating the correct amount of truma. We may not separate truma by size, by weight, or by count. The pasuk says, your truma shall be reckoned to you like grain from the threshing floor and like the ripeness of the vat. The word v'nechshav is understood to mean that truma must be measured by machshava, estimation, and may not be calculated exactly, whether by measuring the portion to be separated, weighing it, or counting the pieces. Avol term was hamodad v'sashokol v'samoneh, but one may separate truma from produce that is measured, weighed, or counted. That is, a person may not measure the portion from which he intends to be truma, but he may measure the produce from which he is separating the truma, and then estimate how much of it he should separate. For example, a person wants to separate a 50th of his produce as truma, first measures all his produce to discover the total amount, and then estimates 1/50th of that total. If he finds that his produce weighs 50 pounds, he separates an amount that he estimates to weigh 1 pound. In termin b'sal b'kupa shem shalmida, and because of this halacha, we may not separate truma with a basket or box that are of a known size. If you have a box that contains 2 pounds, because someone who sees you using this type of container will be suspected of measuring his truma. People who see him might conclude that measuring truma is mutter and start doing it themselves. But one may separate truma with it if he fills only half of it or a third of it, because then it would be clear that he's not measuring the truma, since the amount in the container cannot be known with precision. It's obvious to all that he's only estimating the amount of truma. However, one may not separate truma with a saw container, a container that holds a saw, even if he fills up only half of it, because half of a saw container is an exact measure. Saw containers often have sign in the halfway mark, thus one who fills it up to that point will be suspected of measuring his truma. The use of any saw container, even one that is not marked at the halfway point, is forbidden, because the onlookers will assume that it is marked. Mishnah Ches. In term in Shemin al Zezam Anachtashim. In Mishnah Dalet, we discussed the case of designating olives as truma for olive oil, which is forbidden, because one may not designate unprocessed produce such as olives as truma for processed produce such as olive oil. The Mishnah is going to deal with the opposite case where oil was designated as truma for olives. So one may not separate olive oil as truma for olives that will be crushed. And one may not separate wine as truma for grapes that will be pressed. This is forbidden because one may not designate processed produce such as oil or wine as truma for unprocessed produce such as olives that will be crushed for their oil and grapes that will be pressed for their wine. However, if one did separate truma in either one of these cases, his truma is good. The Mishnah, which addresses the case of designating oil as truma for olives, states that the designation is effective. However, in this Mishnah, which deals with the opposite situation, in Mishnah Dalet, which deals with the opposite situation, designated olives as truma for oil, ruled that the designation does not work. The reason for the difference is that giving a kohen olives instead of oil causes him a loss because he is entitled to receive oil, and he's now burdened with the task of pressing the olives to extract the oil. Therefore, to protect the kohen's interest, the Chachamim decreed that the truma is no good. But if one gives him oil, which he does not have to process, then the truma is valid. But it's a very different svara. Why? But he must separate truma again after the olives are crushed and the grapes are pressed. The first truma, which was separated before the olives were crushed or the grapes were pressed, is good min hatayra, but the Chachamim required the second truma to be separated. Min hatayra, the second truma is not truma at all. Rather, it is tevel. As such, it may not be eaten until the necessary meitzers are taken on its behalf from the produce. The first truma, like other truma midaraisa, makes other produce meduma on its own without the second truma. That is, if the first truma on its own is mixed with ordinary produce, the entire mixture is forbidden as meduma. As we explained in the Hakdama, if 1 unit of truma falls into less than 100 units of chulin, which is ordinary non-truma produce, the entire mixture is forbidden to non-kahanim. The Mishnah says that the first truma makes other produce meduma on its own without the second truma. This point was added to contrast with the Mishnah at the beginning of Parak Gimel, which speaks of 2 portions of truma that make other produce meduma if both portions fell in. If a non-kohen ate the first truma by mistake, for example, he didn't know that it was truma, he's mechuv to pay the extra fifth for it, which is the knas that must be paid for the mistaken consumption of eating truma. The Torah says that if a non-kohen mistakenly eats truma, he must give a kohen produce that's worth the value of truma plus a quarter. This quarter is called a fifth because it's a fifth of the sum total. It's interesting because b'darach klal, the din of chaimesh, which is a din d'oraisa, it's not a knas. It's the Gemara Bab Kama on the Kuf Zayin, I believe it is. That knas is that the chiv of chaimesh is mammon. It's not knas. Avalei shniya, but the second truma, which is only midrabanan, is not subject to either of these laws. It doesn't make ordinary produce meduma, and a non-kain who ate it by mistake does not have to pay the chaimesh. In general, truma midrabanan that falls into ordinary produce does make it meduma. In the Mishnah's case, though, with the rabbanon, where the rabbinical truma was separated, in addition to the rise of the good truma, the laws of meduma will not apply. Mishnah Tes. Retirement shemen al zeitzim anachbashim. Having discussed situations where designating oil as truma for olives, or vice versa, or wine as truma for grapes, or vice versa, is forbidden, the Mishnah presents certain cases in which it's mutter. Retirement shemen al zeitzim anachbashim, but we may separate olive oil as truma for olives that are being pickled, and we may separate wine as truma for grapes that will be made into raisins, since these olives and grapes do not require significant processing. Produce is defined as unprocessed if a significant activity is required to complete its processing. Converting grapes into raisins does not require significant activity, therefore such grapes are considered processed. Separating truma from them for oil or wine in the case of separating truma from processed produce for processed produce which is permitted. The question of whether a person may separate oil as truma for olives or wine as truma for grapes depends on what he intends to do with the olives or grapes. For example, if he intends to eat the olives or grapes, in which case they are already processed, the separation is mutter. But if he intends to crush the olives or grapes, in which case they are not yet processed, the separation is asur. The Mishnah discusses the case where one changed his kavana after the truma was separated. So one separated oil as truma for olives, then he intends to eat the olives, or he separated olives that he intends to eat as truma for olives that he intends to eat, or he separated wine, which is processed produce, as truma for grapes that he intends to eat, which are also processed, or he separates grapes that he intends to eat as truma for other grapes that he intends to eat. Each of these truma designations is mutter, because it involves designating processed produce as truma for processed produce. The same halacha will apply where the olives are pickled or the grapes will be made into raisins, which are also processed produce, as taught in the first part of the Mishnah. Then he changed his mind and decided to press the olives or the grapes for the oil or wine, thus converting them into produce that's not processed. He does not need to separate truma again, since the truma separation was valid when it took place, because all the produce involved was processed. It remains valid even after he decided to press the fruits and thereby changing the current state to unprocessed. Mishnah Yud. We may not separate truma from something whose processing is finished for something whose processing is not finished. And we may not separate truma for something whose processing is not finished for something whose processing is finished. And we may not separate truma from something whose processing is not finished for something whose processing is not finished. Rather, we may separate truma only from processed produce for other processed produce. Different types of produce have different points at which they're considered processed. For example, the processing of grain is complete when after the kernels of grain have been stacked into a pile, the pile has smoothed down, called meruach hakri, which we'll mention throughout the Masechta. Vim tarmu trumas and truma, but if people did separate truma either from or for unprocessed produce, the truma is valid. An exception to the rule was mentioned in Mishnah Dalet, which taught that if olives were designated as truma for olive oil or grapes as truma for wine, the designation is not effective for the reason we explained in that Mishnah over there.